Thomas Murphy was 22 years old when he discovered the cave that would save his life and prove that the most secure shelter sometimes requires swimming to reach it. It was August 1885 in Ludington, Michigan, and Thomas was running from accusations that would have destroyed him whether they were true or not. Thomas had worked at the Whitehall iron mine for 3 years since arriving from Ireland at age 19. He was a good worker, reliable, strong, careful. On August 3rd, 1885, a tunnel collapse killed 2 men. The mine supervisor claimed Thomas had failed to check timber supports properly. Said Thomas's negligence caused the collapse. The dead men's families wanted someone to blame. The mine wanted someone other than management held responsible. Thomas knew the truth. The timber supports had been inadequate, cheaply made, improperly installed by the mine to save money. He'd reported concerns twice, been told to work and stop complaining. When the collapse happened, those reports mysteriously disappeared from mine records. Suddenly, Thomas was the negligent worker facing manslaughter charges. The constable told him he'd be arrested within days once the investigation concluded. Thomas had 2 choices: stay and face trial he'd likely lose because the mine had money and lawyers and he had nothing, or leave and survive somewhere the law couldn't find him. On August 10th, Thomas took his savings, $38, and disappeared from Ludington. He couldn't go back to Ireland, no money for passage, couldn't go to another mining town. His name was known, and mining communities shared information about problem workers. He needed to vanish completely, survive alone until the mine moved on to other concerns and forgot about him. The Lake Michigan shoreline near Ludington was limestone bluffs and rocky beaches, harsh terrain, but also isolated. Thomas had explored the coastline during his time off from mining, swimming in the cold lake water, diving to examine underwater rock formations. He was a strong swimmer, had grown up near the Atlantic in Ireland, spent his youth swimming in cold ocean water. Lake Michigan felt familiar despite being freshwater. He'd discovered something most people never saw: caves with entrances below the waterline. The limestone along this section of Lake Michigan was porous and fractured, carved by ancient water flow into complex systems. Most caves were small alcoves or shallow depressions, but one particular formation had caught his attention in June 1885, 3 months before the mine accident. He'd been diving to examine the cliff face structure, curious about geology after years working underground in mines. Noticed a dark opening at about 12 feet depth. The entrance was maybe 6 feet wide, 4 feet high, substantial opening, but positioned where most swimmers would never see it. You had to dive down deliberately and look specifically at the cliff face. Thomas had been curious enough and confident enough in his swimming to explore. He'd taken several deep breaths on the surface, hyperventilating slightly to increase oxygen in his blood, technique he'd learned from Irish pearl divers who'd worked near his village. Dove down to the opening, examined it carefully. It wasn't just shallow alcove, it was a passage leading back into the cliff. He'd swum into the passage entrance, felt cold water surrounding him, darkness ahead, rock walls on 3 sides. The passage was tight, but navigable. He'd pulled himself forward using handholds on the rock walls, conserving oxygen by moving efficiently rather than swimming hard. 15 feet into the passage, measured later but felt like eternity during that first exploration, the passage angled upward slightly. He'd followed it up. Suddenly, his head broke surface. Air. He'd surfaced inside the cliff in a chamber he couldn't see in the absolute darkness, but could feel by the way his breathing echoed off stone. He'd treaded water in the dark for a moment, catching his breath, trying to understand what he'd found. Then he'd swum back out through the flooded passage, emerged into the bright lake water, surfaced gasping and exhilarated. He'd found an air-filled chamber inside the limestone cliff that was only accessible by diving through an underwater entrance. A chamber inside the limestone cliff that was completely dry, sitting above the lake's water level. The entrance flooded, but the interior was a sealed, air-filled space carved by ancient water flow. The chamber was approximately 15 feet wide, 20 feet deep, 8 feet high at its peak. The floor was mostly dry limestone with some damp areas near where water occasionally seeped through during storms. The walls were solid rock. The ceiling was natural limestone dome. It was dark, no light except what came through the underwater entrance when sun angle was right, but it was dry, stable, and completely hidden. Thomas returned to this cave in mid-August with everything he could carry in waterproof oilcloth bags, beginning a process that would test his physical endurance and psychological resilience beyond anything mining had demanded. The moving process required careful planning. Everything had to fit in waterproof bags that he could strap to his body while swimming through the underwater passage. He couldn't use rigid containers. They wouldn't fit through the tight sections. Had to use flexible oilcloth bags sealed with wax, tested repeatedly in shallow water to ensure they stayed watertight. Each trip followed the same exhausting pattern. Load supplies into bags on shore. Strip to minimal clothing. Swimming in full dress would be impossible. Strap bags to body using rope harnesses he'd fashioned. Wade into the lake. Swim to the cliff face. Dive down 12 feet to the entrance. Find the opening by feel as much as sight. Enter the flooded passage. The underwater swim was terrifying every single time, despite dozens of repetitions. 15 feet doesn't sound far, but 15 feet underwater in darkness, pulling yourself through a narrow rock passage with bags strapped to your body, knowing you can't turn around easily and can't breathe until you reach the other end. 15 feet became a lifetime. His lungs would burn, his heart would race. Panic would edge in at about the 12-foot mark when his oxygen was depleting and he still hadn't broken surface. Then air. He'd surface in the pitch-dark interior chamber, gasping, shaking from adrenaline and cold, feeling the relief of survival, mixed with the knowledge he'd have to do this again to exit. Every entry and exit was a near-death experience that gradually became routine through sheer repetition. He made 17 trips total to move everything he needed. Each trip took 30 minutes minimum, swimming out, gathering next load, swimming back. By the time he completed the final trip in late August, he'd spent more than 8 hours swimming through the underwater passage. 8 hours of sustained fear and physical exertion that would have killed most people from exhaustion or panic. The psychological adaptation to underground life was harder than the physical challenges. The darkness was absolute when he didn't have candles lit, not the darkness of a moonless night where eyes adjust. True, complete absence of light from being inside solid rock with no light source. He couldn't see his hand inches from his face. Navigation was purely by touch and memory of the chamber's layout. The isolation was profound. No human voices, no sounds, except his own breathing and movement and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. No sunlight to mark day and night. His circadian rhythms disrupted completely. He'd sleep when exhausted, wake when rested, with no external cues about time. Sometimes he'd lose track of what day it was, how long he'd been underground. The daily routine was challenging, but manageable. He'd wake before dawn in the pitch-dark cave, light a candle carefully, precious resource that had to last, eat a cold breakfast of preserved food, then prepare for the day's exit. Exiting required swimming. He'd pack whatever he needed for the day into waterproof bags, strip to minimal clothing, take several deep breaths preparing, blow out the candle, navigate by touch to where the entrance passage began. A dark underwater tunnel he could barely see, even with light. Dive down into the water-filled passage, swim through 15 feet of underwater tunnel holding his breath, emerge into open lake water, surface, swim to shore. The entrance was exhausting and dangerous. If he panicked in the underwater passage, he could drown. If he misjudged his breath capacity, he could drown. If he got disoriented in the dark, he could drown, but it also meant absolute security. Nobody would find him. Nobody would even think to look for someone living in a cave that required underwater swimming to access. He'd spend days on the isolated shoreline, fish for food, gather berries and edible plants, avoid populated areas. At evening, he'd repeat the process in reverse. Swim to the underwater entrance, dive through, emerge into his dark cave, light a candle, dry off, prepare for night. The cave's interior remained constant temperature, about 50 degrees year-round due to the thermal mass of the surrounding limestone and the insulating effect of the water at the entrance. Cool but survivable with blankets. Dark and isolated but safe. He built minimal improvements using materials he could carry through the underwater entrance, flat stones arranged as sleeping platform to keep him off the damp floor areas. A crude shelf from a wooden plank wedged into a crack in the rock wall. A fire pit, though he rarely used it because smoke had nowhere to go except back through the underwater entrance, which created dangerous conditions. By October, he'd been living in the underwater cave for 2 months. He was lonely, isolated, living in darkness most of the time, but he was alive and free. The Luddington authorities had presumably stopped looking for him. The mine had moved on. He'd successfully disappeared. October brought cold. Lake Michigan's water temperature dropped from 70 degrees in August to 55 degrees in October. The daily swims became brutally cold, plunging into 55-degree water twice daily to enter and exit the cave. Each swim left him shivering violently, requiring 30 minutes wrapped in blankets to recover body temperature. But the underwater entrance also meant the cave interior never froze. The water at the entrance stayed liquid, hovering just above freezing. That liquid water created a thermal barrier. Cold air couldn't flow directly into the cave because the entrance was underwater. The cave maintained its constant 50-degree temperature even as outside air temperature dropped to 20 degrees. November was harder. Lake temperature dropped to 45 degrees. The swims became dangerous. Cold water shock was real risk. Hypothermia could set in during the 15-foot underwater swim if he wasn't careful. He reduced his exits to once every 2 or 3 days, making supply trips when weather was least harsh. He was running low on food. The fish weren't biting in cold water. The plants were gone for winter. He'd need to risk going to Luddington for supplies, disguised enough that nobody would recognize him. It was dangerous but necessary. On November 20th, he swam out, hiked the 5 miles to Luddington in old clothes that made him look like a transient drifter rather than former miner. Bought supplies with remaining money, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, matches, candles. Avoided eye contact, left quickly. Returned to the underwater cave. December brought the blizzard that changed everything and revealed Thomas's secret to people who needed it desperately. The storm hit December 5th with catastrophic intensity that longtime Michigan residents recognized as potentially deadly. Temperature dropped from 20 degrees at dawn to 0 by noon to -10 by evening to -20 by midnight. Wind off Lake Michigan built steadily. 20 miles per hour becoming 40, becoming sustained 60, with gusts to 80. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to 0. You couldn't see your hand at arm's length. The world became white noise and screaming wind. Lake Michigan's surface turned violent. Waves built to 10 feet despite the cold. Ice formed along the shoreline, but the main lake surface stayed liquid from wave action, churning, freezing, deadly. The water temperature hovered at 35 degrees, cold enough to kill in minutes, but not frozen solid. Thomas was trapped in his underwater cave by the storm. He'd returned from his last supply run on December 4th evening. Swum through the entrance passage, surfaced in the cave, pulled himself out, dried off, settled in for what he expected would be normal cold weather. By December 5th morning, he understood from the muffled sounds penetrating the rock that this was different. He could hear the wind, distant roar that vibrated through the limestone. Could feel subtle pressure changes as the storm raged outside. Knew attempting to swim out would be suicide. The lake surface was violent. The underwater passage would be filled with turbulent water. He'd drown before reaching the entrance. He was sealed inside with whatever supplies he had. No way out until the storm ended. The realization was terrifying. If the storm lasted longer than his supplies, he'd die trapped underground. But he forced calm. Had food for a week if he rationed carefully. Had water from the seepage that dripped into a depression in the cave floor. Had candles for perhaps 5 days if used sparingly. Could survive a normal blizzard. On shore, 300 yards from Thomas's hidden cave, the Henderson family's fishing shanty was becoming a death trap for people who'd sought shelter there. The shanty had been built for summer and autumn use, simple wooden structure where fishermen could store equipment and take breaks. Walls were thin boards. Roof was tar paper and shingles, no insulation, no heating system beyond what people might bring. It was never intended for winter occupation during extreme weather. 4 people fleeing Luddington's failing buildings had reached the shanty by December 5th afternoon. Jacob Moore and his wife Sarah had left their house when interior temperature dropped to 40 degrees, despite continuous fire. Their wood was depleted. The house couldn't maintain heat. They'd walked the 3 miles to the shoreline, hoping the Henderson shanty would provide better shelter. They'd found 2 other refugees already there, Martin Peterson and Elizabeth Chen, who'd fled separate failed housing situations. 4 desperate people in a structure that couldn't protect them. By evening, December 5th, the shanty interior was 20 degrees, barely warmer than outside. The wind penetrated every gap in construction. The thin walls provided almost no insulation. They had no heat source, nothing to burn, no stove. They huddled together, wrapped in whatever blankets they'd carried, shivering violently, knowing this wouldn't work. By morning, December 6th, day 2, the shanty was 10 degrees inside, -20 outside, 10 degrees inside, with 4 people's body heat the only warmth. Martin had frostbite on his fingers. Elizabeth was showing confusion and lethargy, hypothermia setting in. Sarah's lips were blue. Jacob knew they were dying. Jacob made a desperate decision. He'd noticed unusual rock formations along the shoreline during summer fishing trips, remembered seeing what might have been a cave entrance at the base of the limestone cliff. If they could reach it, maybe the cave would provide better shelter than the failing shanty. They left the shanty on the morning of December 7th, struggled 200 yards through blizzard conditions, found the limestone cliff. Searched desperately for the cave entrance Jacob remembered. They couldn't find it. The entrance was underwater, invisible. They stood at the cliff base in -20 wind, searching for shelter that seemed not to exist, facing death from exposure. Thomas, inside the cave, heard nothing, was isolated by rock and water, had no idea people were dying 200 yards from his location. Then Sarah Moore did something desperate. She'd been a strong swimmer in youth. Noticed the water at the cliff base wasn't frozen, strange given the extreme cold. Wondered if the cave entrance might be underwater. It seemed insane, but they were dying anyway. She stripped to undergarments despite -20 temperature, told Jacob she'd try diving. Took several deep breaths, dove into the 40-degree water. Shock nearly stopped her heart. Felt along the underwater cliff face. Found the opening, dark passage leading into rock. Surfaced, gasping from cold. "There's a passage, underwater. I don't know where it goes." They faced impossible choice. Dive into 40-degree water through underwater passage that might lead nowhere, or freeze to death on shore. 4 people with no real options. Jacob went first. Dove into the killing cold water, found the passage opening, swam through blindly, holding breath, praying it led somewhere. 15 feet felt like eternity. Then air. He surfaced inside the dark chamber, felt rock around him. breathed, yelled back through the underwater passage, his voice echoing strangely through water and stone. "It's here! Cave inside! Air! Come through!" Sarah came next, then the other two. 4 people emerging one by one into Thomas's secret cave, into 50-degree air that felt warm after -20 outside, into darkness lit only by the candle Thomas had burning. Thomas, sitting on his stone sleeping platform, watched 4 frozen people emerge from the underwater entrance passage into his hidden cave. 4 people who'd found his secret shelter through desperate survival instinct. Nobody spoke initially, too shocked, too cold, too overwhelmed by the situation. Finally, Jacob managed words through chattering teeth. Who are you? You live here? In a cave? With underwater entrance?" "Thomas Murphy. And yes, I've been living here since August. You shouldn't be here. Nobody should know about this cave. We're dying. The shanty failed. Buildings in Luddington can't stay warm. We dove through underwater because we're dead otherwise. Please let us stay until the blizzard ends." Thomas looked at 4 hypothermic people dripping water on his cave floor. He could refuse, could force them back out, protect his secret, or he could share his shelter with people who needed it desperately. "You can stay, but when this is over, you tell nobody about this cave. Nobody. I need this place to stay secret. You understand?" They understood. 4 people crowded into the 15 by 20 cave with Thomas, sat wrapped in his blankets, sharing the minimal warmth he had. The combined body heat of 5 people raised the cave temperature from 50 to 55 degrees. Not comfortable, but survivable. The blizzard lasted 3 days total. Through all of it, 5 people survived in the underwater cave. 8 Thomas's meager supplies slept on the stone floor, dealt with complete darkness when the candles ran low, learned to trust each other through shared crisis. When the storm ended December 8th, they swam back out through the underwater entrance one by one, emerged into cleared weather and shocking sunlight after 3 days in absolute darkness. Found Luddington in disaster, buildings frozen, people dead from hypothermia, the town devastated by cold that had overwhelmed every structure except the underwater cave. Jacob Moore stood dripping on the shore after swimming out, his body shaking from the 40-degree water, but alive when he should be dead. He looked at the limestone cliff that hid the entrance. Understanding that an underwater cave requiring swimming to access had saved 5 people through thermal stability nobody could have predicted. "You saved us," Jacob said, when his teeth stopped chattering enough to speak. "That cave, nobody would believe it exists. Nobody would believe you live there, swim through underwater passage twice a day just to enter and exit your home. But it worked when everything else failed. When buildings people trusted killed them." "You promised not to tell anyone about the location," Thomas reminded him, fear creeping back about exposure and discovery. "I'll keep my promise about the cave location, but you should know something else. The mine dropped the charges against you. Happened back in September. They found evidence contradicting their claims. Their own records showed the timber supports were inadequate, that you'd reported concerns they ignored. The investigation cleared you completely. You're not wanted. You haven't been wanted for 3 months." The words took a moment to process. Thomas had been living in an underwater cave for 4 months, swimming through a flooded passage twice daily, surviving in darkness and isolation, believing he was a fugitive, while the actual charges had been dropped 3 weeks after he fled. The mine had found their own documentation proving Thomas's innocence. They'd looked for him to tell him he was cleared, but couldn't find him because he'd vanished completely. "I can go back to town, to normal life." "You can, you're free. The mine even paid compensation to the dead men's families, admitted fault. You could probably work there again if you wanted, though I understand why you wouldn't." Thomas stood on the shore processing this information. He'd been free for months without knowing it, could have left the underwater cave any time after September, could have returned to conventional housing, normal employment, regular life. But as he stood there dripping lake water, looking at the cliff that hid his secret underwater home, he realized something profound. The past 4 months hadn't been just about hiding. They'd been about discovering that he preferred underground life to surface existence, the constant temperature, the absolute isolation, the security of a dwelling that nobody could reach without swimming, the peace of darkness and silence. Conventional housing felt wrong now. The thought of living in a wooden building with neighbors nearby, with noise and light and temperature swings, felt oppressive. He'd adapted to underground life in ways that made surface living unappealing. Over the following weeks, Thomas made an unusual choice. He returned to Luddington openly, no longer hiding. Got work at a lumber mill, better conditions than mining, no underground danger. Rented a small room above the general store as his official address where mail could reach him and where he could maintain social appearance. But he kept using the underwater cave. Would spend 3 or 4 nights per week there, swimming through the flooded passage to reach his secret home. The cave became refuge rather than prison, place he chose rather than place he needed. People in Luddington knew vaguely that Thomas had some kind of shelter on the shoreline, knew he was eccentric about swimming in cold water. But they didn't know about the underwater entrance or the exact location. The 4 people he'd sheltered during the blizzard kept their promise, never revealed the cave's position, never described the underwater passage, maintained Thomas's secret. The Henderson fishing shanty that had failed during the blizzard was rebuilt in spring 1886, but Jacob Moore made improvements based on what he'd learned in the underwater cave, added thick insulation, created an interior room within the larger structure. Double walls with airspace between like the rock walls and water of Thomas's cave provided natural insulation. The rebuilt shanty was mocked initially for being over-engineered. Then the next hard winter proved Jacob right. His insulated design stayed warm while other shanties failed. Thomas consulted informally on the design, explaining thermal mass and insulation principles he'd learned from living underground. At 22, he'd become the man who understood how earth and water created natural climate control. The former fugitive who'd hidden in an underwater cave became the informal expert on thermal stability. By 1890, 5 years after the blizzard, Thomas had achieved unusual balance. He maintained conventional social connections in Luddington, had friends, dated occasionally, participated in community life. But he also maintained his secret underwater cave as private sanctuary, would swim through the flooded passage regularly, spend nights alone in 50-degree darkness, emerge refreshed in ways that surface living couldn't provide. The Henderson fishing shanty that had failed during the blizzard was rebuilt, but people remembered that the hidden cave had functioned when conventional shelter died. Thomas lived until 1938, dying at age 75. His obituary mentioned the underwater cave, the limestone chamber with the submerged entrance that had sheltered 5 people during the blizzard of 1885. The space that required swimming to reach but maintained perfect temperature with no heating system. The cave still exists. The entrance is still 12 feet underwater at the limestone cliff base. Divers occasionally find it, swim through the flooded passage, emerge into the dry chamber inside. Modern analysis confirms the thermal stability. Constant 50-degree temperature year-round, regardless of external conditions. The story is about a man who found the most secure shelter by accident while running from false accusations, who survived 4 months swimming through underwater passages daily, who proved that the best hiding places sometimes require swimming to reach, and whose secret cave saved lives when conventional structures failed, because sometimes the most secure house is the one nobody can see. The underwater entrance that seems impossible is actually perfect security. And limestone caves with flooded passages provide better shelter than expensive construction when you understand how they work.